The boy couldn't speak. He hadn't said a word in 3 years. But when he ran barefoot across the scorched Kansas dust and shoved that crumpled note into a stranger's hand, he said everything. "Please, save my mama. They come tonight." The stranger read it once, twice. Then he folded it carefully, tucked it into his coat, and looked down at the boy with eyes that had seen too much of this world's worst. "Take me to her," he said quietly. If this story moves you, friends, subscribe to our channel, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat that summer had turned the Kansas territory into something that barely resembled Earth anymore. The grass had burned down to pale yellow stubble weeks ago. The creek beds ran dry, or near dry, cracked open like old wounds. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat low and flat against the horizon, dust rising off the main road every time a horse moved through it, and the sky above pressed down white and merciless, with no cloud anywhere to break it. Samuel Holt hadn't planned to stop here. He had ridden through a dozen towns like this one in the last 2 months. Towns with the same tired faces, the same sagging buildings, the same feeling of something quietly dying underneath the surface. He was heading north. No particular reason, just north felt different from where he'd been, and that was enough. He'd given up needing reasons about a year ago. He pulled Ranger to a slow walk as they entered the main road. The animal was tired, and so was he. 1 night, maybe 2. Rest water supplies then gone. He was still deciding which building held the livery when the boy hit him. Not hard, but sudden enough that Samuel's hand dropped automatically to his revolver before he registered what he was seeing. A child. A boy, maybe 8 years old, barefoot shirt, soaked through with sweat brown hair stuck flat against his forehead. The boy had run straight out from between 2 buildings and grabbed Samuel's stirrup with both hands, panting hard, eyes wild and desperate. "Easy," Samuel steadied Ranger. "Easy, son." The boy looked up at him. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Samuel frowned. "You all right?" Again nothing. The boy's face twisted with the effort of trying jaw-working, lips moving, but the sound simply wasn't there. His eyes filled fast. He let go of the stirrup and shoved his hand into his trouser pocket, digging frantically, and pulled out a folded piece of paper crumpled and damp with sweat. He held it up with both hands, arms straight like an offering. Samuel leaned down slowly and took it. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was a child's, uneven and pressing hard into the page, some letters larger than others. But every word was clear. "Please, sir, my mama needs help. Mr. Briggs' men came this morning. They say we have to leave, but mama won't go. Please. They come back tonight. Nobody in town will help us. Please. Tommy." Samuel read it once. Then he read it again slower. The boy. Tommy watched his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read every small shift in an adult's expression because words were unavailable to him. Samuel refolded the note and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then he looked down at the child. "How far?" Tommy pointed down the road, then turned and pointed east toward the open land beyond the last buildings of town. "Take me to her," Samuel said. For a fraction of a second, Tommy's whole face changed. The desperate tightness broke open into something raw and relieved and almost too much to look at directly. Then he turned and ran, and Samuel nudged Ranger forward at a steady walk behind him. He hadn't gone 20 yards down the main road when a man stepped off the boardwalk and put himself casually in the path between horse and destination. Not blocking, not exactly, just standing there the way men stand when they want to be noticed without admitting they're trying to stop something. "Morning." The man had a deputy's badge pinned to a shirt that hadn't been washed recently. He was young, maybe 25, with small eyes that moved from Samuel to the boy and back again. Samuel stopped Ranger. "Morning. Don't believe I've seen you through here before. No reason you would have been." The deputy smiled without much warmth. "Where you headed?" "East Road." The deputy tilted his head slightly, looked past Samuel toward Tommy, who had stopped 20 feet ahead, and turned back to watch with his hands balled at his sides. "That boy bothering you?" "No." He's got a habit of accosting strangers. The deputy's voice stayed easy conversational. His mama put him up to it. She's been trying to get people riled up about something that ain't really any of their concern. Samuel kept his voice even. He asked for directions. I'm obliging him. The deputy studied him a moment longer. Harlan's Crossing's a quiet town, mister. Folks here like to keep it that way. I imagine they do, Samuel said. He moved Ranger forward, and the deputy stepped aside just enough to let him pass not an inch more than necessary. Samuel didn't look back. Tommy was already moving again faster now, and Samuel followed him off the main road and down a narrower track heading east, the dry grass scraping against his boots as the town fell away behind them. The heat pressed down harder away from the buildings. The air smelled of dust and something faintly bitter dried-out earth that hadn't seen rain in too long. The homestead appeared slowly out of the flat land. A cabin, a small barn, a kitchen garden that had been fighting the drought hard and losing, and a fenced area where 2 chickens moved in the dust. It was a working place, not a fine one, but someone had cared for it. There were flower boxes under the front windows, dry now, but placed there deliberately by someone who had planned to stay. There was a wagon in the yard with 3 men around it. 2 of the men were loading things into the wagon, not loading with the owner's permission, loading the way men load when they don't expect to be challenged. Furniture, a wooden trunk, a crate of kitchen items. One of them had a rifle leaning against the wagon wheel. The 3rd man stood on the porch with his back to the yard, and a woman stood in the doorway facing him, and even from 50 yards away, Samuel could see from the set of her shoulders that she had been standing that way for a long time, and she had not moved, and she was not going to. He pulled Ranger to a stop and dismounted. Tommy ran ahead toward the cabin, then stopped himself at the edge of the yard, clearly having learned through painful experience that running at those men accomplished nothing. He looked back at Samuel with that same desperate expression. Samuel walked forward. He heard the man on the porch before he reached the yard. Mrs. Voss, this is the last time I'm going to explain this to you. Mr. Briggs holds the note on this property. Your husband took that loan in good faith, and he is gone now. God rest him, and you cannot pay it back, and that is simply the end of the matter. My husband didn't take any loan from Harlan Briggs. The woman's voice was tired, steady, and absolutely unconvinced. I have told you that 4 times now. Whatever paper you're waving at me, I never signed it, and my husband never signed it. Ma'am. And I'd like you to put my grandmother's trunk back where you found it. Samuel stepped through the yard gate. The man loading the wagon saw him first and straightened up. His partner did the same. The one with the rifle picked it up slowly, not pointing it, just holding it. The man on the porch turned at the sound of boots on the porch steps and found Samuel 2 steps below him. He was somewhere around 50, dressed better than the men in the yard, with a wide-brimmed hat and a careful expression. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to arriving at places and having his presence resolve problems. Who are you? He asked. Someone passing through, Samuel said. Who are you? The man blinked once at the question, like it didn't happen to him often. My name is Warren Cole. I represent Harlan Briggs, who is both the president of Harlan's Crossing Bank and the justice of the peace for this county. He let that sit for a moment. This is a legal matter between Mr. Briggs and the widow of Joseph Voss. I see. Samuel looked past him at the woman in the doorway. Eleanor Voss was younger than he expected, maybe 32. Her hair was the dark reddish-brown of polished walnut, and it was coming loose from where she'd pinned it, strands falling across a face that was drawn tight with exhaustion and heat and fury in equal measure. Her dress was plain gray cotton, faded at the shoulders, and she had her arms crossed at her chest, not defensively, but the way a person crosses their arms when they are holding themselves together through sheer stubbornness. She looked at Samuel, the way a woman looks at a stranger who shows up during the worst moment of her life, grateful and wary in the same breath, and certain that gratitude is the more dangerous of the two. Ma'am, Samuel said. Sir, she replied. He turned back to Cole. What's the amount of the loan? Cole's expression shifted slightly. That's not really... What's the amount? A pause. $420. And the term 6 months. It came due last Friday. And when was this loan issued? Cole hesitated for the first time. 18 months ago. So it was issued, Samuel said slowly. About 3 months before Joseph Voss died. That is correct. And Briggs waited until the husband was in the ground and the wife was alone to collect. Cole's jaw tightened. The timing of Mr. Voss's passing is unfortunate, but it doesn't change the legal. I want to see the original note, Samuel said. The one with the signatures. I don't believe that's any of your... It's a simple request, Mr. Cole. Samuel's voice stayed completely level. If the document is legitimate, showing it costs you nothing. If you'd rather not show it, that tells me something too. The two men in the yard were watching now. The one with the rifle had his thumb resting near the hammer. Samuel noted it and said nothing about it. Cole reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out with the expression of a man making a point. Samuel took it. He unfolded it carefully and read through it twice. His expression didn't change, but something did behind his eyes, a quiet, cold recognition, like a man who has seen a particular kind of trick before and knows exactly what he's looking at. He refolded the paper and handed it back. That's Joseph Voss's signature on the bottom, he asked. It is. You're sure? Mr. Briggs witnessed it personally. Samuel looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Voss, did your husband ever mention borrowing from Briggs? Never, she said. Not once. We had the money for that year's taxes set aside. We had no reason to borrow anything. People don't always tell their wives, Cole began. My husband told me everything. Her voice didn't waver. We built this place together. There is not a single thing on this property that happened without both of us knowing about it. He did not borrow $420 from Harlan Briggs. With respect, ma'am. And that is not his signature. The yard went quiet for a moment, except for the dry hiss of wind moving through the dead grass. Cole straightened. Mrs. Voss, I understand grief can... I have his letters, she said. 15 years of letters. Would you like to stand here in this heat and compare them to what you're holding? Cole said nothing. Samuel looked at the document again in Cole's hand and looked at Eleanor, and for just a moment, something moved through him that he had been carefully avoiding for a long time. It wasn't anger exactly. It was older than anger. It was the particular sickness of watching something recognizable happen to someone who didn't deserve it, and the specific weight of knowing that he had the ability to stop it, and that stopping it would cost him something. He had been keeping himself cheap lately. Quiet. Uninvested. He looked down at Tommy, who had come to stand at the edge of the porch below him, and the boy was watching his face again, reading every small shift, waiting, and Samuel thought about the note. Nobody in town will help us. Mr. Cole, Samuel said, I'd like you to put Mrs. Voss's property back inside her house. Cole looked at him with the patient expression of a man explaining something to someone slow. And who exactly are you to make that request? My name is Samuel Holt. He watched Cole's face and saw the name register a small tightening around the eyes, a slight pause. Cole knew the name. That was useful information. I spent 6 years as a federal investigator out of the Topeka office before I left that work. I have read enough loan documents and enough forged signatures to know the difference between the two. Cole's confident expression had gone careful and still. I am going to be in this county for a while, Samuel continued. And while I'm here, I'm going to look very carefully at this loan document and at how Joseph Voss died, and at what the water rights situation looks like on this stretch of land. Because someone who wanted this property badly enough to forge a dead man's name is someone who wants something specific from this land. And I find it very interesting, he said quietly, that the one working water source within 4 miles sits exactly on the eastern edge of this homestead. He let that sit. Cole was absolutely still now. You have my property, Eleanor said from the doorway. Her voice had changed, not softer, but different. Like something under pressure had suddenly found a direction to push. Cole looked at her. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the men in the yard who were looking at him for instruction, and he found no good instruction to give. "We'll settle this through proper legal channels," he said at last. His voice had lost its easy authority. "I'll be there," Samuel said. Cole said something to the men in the yard, short-clipped, and they put down what they were holding. The trunk went back. The furniture. Cole gathered the rifle himself, leaning it against the wagon rather than handing it back. He climbed up to the wagon seat without looking at anyone. "Mrs. Voss," he said flatly. "Mr. Briggs will be in contact." "He knows where I live," she said. The wagon moved out of the yard. Samuel watched it go until it reached the road and turned back toward town, and the dust began to settle. Behind him, he heard the screen door and then small bare feet on the porch boards, and Tommy appeared beside his mother, and she pulled him against her side, with one arm pressing her face into his hair for just a moment before she straightened again. She looked at Samuel. "They'll come back," she said. "You know that." "Yes, ma'am. With more men. Maybe the sheriff." "Likely." She studied him. "Why did you help me?" Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out the crumpled note and held it up. He watched her face when she recognized the handwriting. "Your son found me on the road," he said. "He asked for help." He held the note out toward Tommy. The boy took it carefully and looked up at Samuel with an expression that was impossible to fully look at and remain unchanged by. Eleanor Voss watched her son. Something moved across her face, the particular expression of a mother watching her child's hope be honored rather than broken. "You should know what you're stepping into," she said. "I have a fair idea. Harlan Briggs doesn't lose quietly. He owns the judge in this county, and the sheriff is his cousin by marriage, and half the men in town owe him money one way or another." She said it all plainly, without drama, the way a person recites facts they have spent sleepless nights living with. "My husband was a good man, and a careful man, and he's dead. And I don't know for certain that it wasn't Briggs who made that happen, but I suspect it, and I have no way to prove it, and the people who might help me are afraid of losing what little they have left." Samuel was quiet for a moment. The heat pressed down on the yard. A chicken moved through the dust near the fence. "Do you have a copy of your husband's original land grant?" he asked. "Yes." "And any letters or papers from around the time that loan was supposedly issued?" "I have everything. I kept everything." Her chin lifted slightly. "I always knew something like this might come." "Then we start there." He looked toward the cabin. "If you're willing to let me look through them." Eleanor Voss was quiet for a moment. She looked at her son, who was still holding the crumpled note, who was watching Samuel with absolute certainty, the way children sometimes trust before adults have earned it. She looked back at Samuel. "I'll put the coffee on," she said. And as she turned and went inside, and as Tommy tugged Samuel's sleeve and pointed urgently at the door, and then at his mother's retreating back, "Come on, come on." Samuel stood for one moment in the scorched Kansas heat, and felt something he had spent a year and a half carefully dismantling begin quietly, and without permission to reassemble itself. He followed them inside. The coffee was strong and bitter, and Eleanor apologized for it without sounding particularly sorry, which Samuel appreciated. He sat at the kitchen table with Joseph Voss's papers spread in front of him, while the afternoon heat pushed through the walls of the cabin, and Tommy sat across from him, with his chin resting on his folded arms, watching every movement Samuel made with the focused attention of a child who had decided something important and was waiting for the world to confirm it. Eleanor stood at the window, not pacing, just standing the way people stand when sitting feels like surrender. "This is the original land grant," Samuel said, smoothing the document flat. "Filed in '68, 6 years ago. Joseph filed it himself, rode to Topeka and back in 4 days." She said it without turning from the window. "He was so proud of that paper he kept it in the Bible for 2 years before I made him put it somewhere safer." Smart woman. He thought so. A pause. "Usually." Samuel looked at the loan document Cole had shown him and the land grant side by side. He didn't say anything for a moment. Tommy watched his face with that precise reading attention. "The signature on the loan document," Samuel said carefully. "Your husband signed his name with a middle initial." Eleanor turned from the window. "No, never. Joseph didn't put stock in middle initials. Said they were something men added when they wanted to seem more important than they were. She crossed to the table and looked at where Samuel's finger rested. That's not his signature. No, Samuel agreed. It isn't. She sat down then across from him, and for the first time since he'd walked into her yard, he saw the exhaustion underneath the fury. It was profound and old, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for long enough that they'd stopped remembering what it felt like not to be fighting. How long has Briggs been after this land? Samuel asked. He made his first offer 8 months after Joseph died. Very polite, very reasonable. Her voice was flat. The water rights were all he mentioned. He said he was interested in the property for grazing, but what he actually wanted was access to the creek. That creek feeds how much land to the east? Everything from here to the Cowboy property, about 4 miles. Without it, that whole stretch goes dry in a summer like this one. She looked at him steadily. Briggs owns the Cowboy property. He bought it last year. Paid almost nothing for it because without reliable water it was worthless. But if he controlled your water source, it would double the value of everything he already owns overnight. She said it simply, without bitterness, just fact. Joseph figured it out 2 months before he died. He started writing letters to the land office in Topeka about establishing formal water rights documentation. She reached across the table and pulled a thin bundle of papers from the stack. These are the drafts. He never finished sending them. Samuel took the bundle. He read through the first 2 letters slowly. Joseph Voss had been a careful man with language precise and methodical. The kind of man who chose words the way he would choose tools, the right one for the right job, no more. How did he die? Samuel asked. He kept his voice neutral. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He fell from the barn roof, she said. He was repairing a section that had come loose after a storm. Tommy found him. She glanced at her son. Tommy was looking at the table now, his jaw tight, a small boy carrying something much too heavy for his size. The doctor said it was an accident. Nothing suspicious. A man loses his footing. It happens. She paused. But Joseph had been on that roof 100 times. He was careful about heights. He was careful about everything. Samuel said nothing. He set the letters down. You think Briggs had him killed? He said quietly. I think Joseph was in the middle of filing paperwork that would have permanently blocked Briggs from ever touching that water. And I think he died 10 days before that paperwork would have been complete. She met his eyes. I can't prove it. I have thought about almost nothing else for 14 months, and I cannot prove it. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, one of the chickens moved through the dust, and the dry grass made a whispering sound against the fence boards. Tommy reached across the table and put his hand over his mother's, and she turned her palm up and held it. Samuel stood and walked to the window she had been standing at, and looked out at the yard, at the lane leading back to the main road, at the flat Kansas land, stretching out under the white, punishing sky. He thought about the deputy on the road this morning, the casual way he'd stepped into the path, the way Cole had recognized his name. Briggs already knows I'm here, Samuel said. How quickly? Cole will have ridden straight back to town. Briggs will have heard within the hour. He turned from the window. Which means we have at most until tomorrow morning, before something happens. Either legal, a sheriff's visit with formal eviction papers, or otherwise. Eleanor's expression didn't change much. She had already been living with this possibility. And which do you think it will be? Legal first, Samuel said. Briggs is a careful man. He won't move without cover. But if the legal approach fails, and if I'm the reason it fails... He paused. Then I become a problem he needs to solve separately. I won't have you hurt on account of us, Eleanor said immediately. With respect, Mrs. Voss, that's not your decision to make. She looked at him hard. You don't owe us anything. No, Samuel said. He looked at Tommy, who had taken his small folded note back out and was smoothing it carefully on the tabletop. But your son asked me a direct question this morning, and I said yes. I don't unsay things. Tommy looked up at him. His expression was something between wonder and the fierce private loyalty of a child who has been disappointed by adults enough times that trust, when it arrives with his whole self. Samuel turned back to Eleanor. I need to ride into town. That's not. I need to see the land office. If your husband was in the process of filing water rights documentation, there may be partial records. Even a preliminary filing creates a paper trail that complicates Briggs's position significantly. He picked up the bundle of letters. May I take these? Yes. She stood. I want to come with you. No. She straightened. Mr. Holt, if we both ride in, Briggs sees it as a confrontation and he responds accordingly. If I ride in alone, I'm a stranger looking at public records, which is something I have every legal right to do and something he can't easily object to without revealing that he has a reason to object. Samuel kept his voice even. You stay here. Keep the door latched. If anyone comes and it isn't me, don't open it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment with the measuring expression of a woman who had learned to evaluate men through hard experience and was running her honest assessment of this one. You were a federal investigator, she said. I was. Why did you leave? It was a fair question asked plainly, and he had several answers prepared by habit for occasions when people asked it. He used none of them. I let a man hang for something I wasn't certain enough he'd done, Samuel said. I had doubts and I swallowed them because it was easier, and he died, and 6 months later I found the information that would have saved him. He said it without flinching, the way you say something you have said to yourself so many times, that the edges are worn smooth. After that, I didn't feel much like holding a badge. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, And now I feel like riding into town and looking at some land records, Samuel said. If you'll excuse me. He was almost to the door when Tommy appeared in front of him, materializing with the soundless, sudden speed of children, and held up his small hand. In his palm was the crumpled note. Samuel looked at it. Tommy pointed at the note, then at Samuel, then at his own chest, back and forth. His expression was entirely serious. You want me to take it with me? Samuel asked. Tommy shook his head. He pointed at Samuel, then pressed his hand to his own chest again, more firmly, his small face intent with the effort of being understood. You want me to? Samuel looked at the note again. You want me to know you're counting on me? Tommy nodded once. Hard. Certain. Samuel took a breath. He took the note, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket over his heart deliberately so the boy could see exactly where it went. Tommy stepped aside and let him pass. The town of Harlan's Crossing was pretending to go about its business when Samuel rode in. Pretending because the business had a slow, careful quality to it. Men finding reasons to be on the boardwalk, women pausing in doorways, the blacksmith working with one eye on the road. Word traveled fast in drought country, where there wasn't much else to carry. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the bank and a dry goods store. The man behind the counter was young and soft-spoken, with ink on his fingers and the slightly hunted look of someone who worked for a town that Harlan Briggs owned. I'm looking at public filings on a parcel east of town, Samuel said. He gave the lot description from the land grant. Any activity on this property in the last 2 years? The young man's hands went still on the counter for just a moment. I'd need to pull the ledger. I'll wait. The man disappeared through a back door. Samuel waited. He looked around the small office at the maps on the walls at the county survey chart framed behind glass. He found the eastern section and traced the creek line with his eyes. There was Eleanor Voss's property, and there directly adjacent running from it, in a clean line east, the land Briggs had bought for nothing because it had no water. The young man came back with the ledger. He set it on the counter and opened it to the right section and stepped back as if he wanted distance from what Samuel was about to read. Samuel read through the entries for the Voss parcel carefully. The original filing, a tax payment entry 2 years ago. Then a notation from 11 months back, preliminary water rights inquiry submitted, pending full documentation, and then 8 weeks later, the notation that made his jaw tighten, application withdrawn per submitting party. Who withdrew it? Samuel asked. The young man looked at his shoes. The record shows the submitting party. Joseph Voss died 14 months ago. This withdrawal was recorded 11 months ago. Samuel looked at the clerk directly. Joseph Voss was 3 months dead when this withdrawal was filed. So who actually submitted it? The clerk said nothing for a long moment. "Son," Samuel said quietly, "I understand you're in a difficult position. I understand that Harlan Briggs signs the check that keeps this office running and that crossing him has consequences in a town this size. I am not asking you to do anything except tell me what you know." The young man looked toward the front window, then at the ledger, then at Samuel, with the expression of someone calculating whether the cost of telling the truth was finally less than the cost of living with not having told it. "I wasn't working here when that withdrawal was filed," he said carefully. "My predecessor was. He left town pretty sudden last spring." A pause. "Moved his whole family out inside of a week. Said he'd found better work in Wichita." Samuel looked at him. "I'm just saying," the clerk said very quietly, "that the handwriting on that withdrawal notation doesn't look like any notation my predecessor made in any other entry in that ledger." Samuel looked at the notation again, then at the surrounding entries at the handwriting patterns. The clerk was right. The ink color was slightly different too, less faded, written more recently than its date suggested. "Can I get a copy of this page?" Samuel asked. "The public is entitled to copies of public records," the clerk said. He had made a decision and was moving through it quickly now. "It'll take me about 10 minutes. I'll be outside." Samuel stepped out into the afternoon heat. The main road of Harlan's Crossing lay quiet and attentive around him. He stood on the boardwalk and let his eyes move along the building fronts unhurriedly until they reached the bank at the far end of the street, a solid, well-maintained building with white-painted trim and curtained windows. Harlan Briggs's name was painted on the glass in careful gold letters. The front curtain moved slightly. Someone stepping back from the window. Samuel didn't react. He pulled his hat down slightly against the sun and stood and waited. The voice came from his right from the shadows between two buildings. "You ought to be careful, Mr. Holt." Samuel turned. A woman stood in the narrow gap, older somewhere around 60, with sharp, dark eyes and a flour-dusted apron. She had the practical, self-sufficient look of someone who had been watching this town for a long time, from behind the counter of a business Briggs hadn't managed to acquire. "Ma'am," Samuel said. "May Colton. I run the general store." She didn't move from the shadow. "I've been watching Harlan Briggs run this county for 12 years. I know what he's capable of." "I'm beginning to," Samuel said. "Joseph Voss didn't fall off that barn," she said. It came out flat and deliberate, the voice of someone stating a fact they have held alone for over a year. "I don't have proof of it either. But Denny Marsh, he works Briggs's south pasture. He was drunk in my store the night after Joseph died, and he said something he probably wishes he hadn't." "What did he say?" May Colton looked toward the bank window, then back at Samuel. "He said, 'Well, the water problem's solved.' And then he went quiet and paid for his tobacco and walked out." She paused. "He's been crossing the street to avoid me ever since." Samuel was still. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because Eleanor Voss is a good woman who has done nothing wrong, and that boy of hers was talking before his father died and hasn't said a word since. And I am tired, Mr. Holt, of being the kind of person who watches things happen from a safe distance." She straightened. "Denny Marsh drinks at the saloon on Thursday evenings. It is Thursday today." She walked back into the alley and was gone. Samuel stood for a moment in the heat, turning it over, assembling the shape of what was in front of him. A forged signature. A doctored land record. A man who died at exactly the right moment. A witness who talked when he was drinking. He went back inside and collected the copied page from the clerk, folded it carefully with Joseph Voss's letters, and slid the whole packet into his coat. He mounted Ranger and turned back toward the east road. The sun was dropping now, still brutally hot, but angled lower, throwing long shadows off the buildings. He had maybe 4 hours before dark. He thought about Eleanor standing at that window. About Tommy pressing the note against his chest. "Here, keep it here. Don't lose it," with the complete seriousness of a child making a contract. He thought about the water problem being solved. He pushed Ranger to a faster pace. He needed to get back to the homestead before dark, and he needed to be at that saloon Thursday evening, and there was something else building at the edge of his thinking that he hadn't fully formed yet, a shape in the evidence, something about the timing of the loan document, and the land records, and the withdrawal notation. Something that wasn't quite sitting right, that was asking a question he didn't have the answer to yet. The homestead appeared in the distance, a dark shape against the bleached evening land. He could see the lamp in the window from half a mile away. She had left the light on for him. He rode toward it. Eleanor had the lamp turned low when he rode in, and she was sitting at the table with a rifle across her knees that she moved aside the moment she recognized his silhouette through the window. She didn't say anything about the rifle. Neither did he. Tommy was asleep on the narrow cot in the corner, one arm hanging off the edge, the crumpled note tucked under his pillow where Samuel could see the edge of it. The boy had folded it smaller before bed, keeping it closer. "Anything while I was gone?" Samuel asked. "Ryder came down the lane about 2 hours ago, didn't stop, just slowed down, looked at the house and kept going." Eleanor set the rifle against the wall. "I didn't recognize him." "Briggs checking to see if you're still here. That's what I thought." She moved to the stove and lifted the coffee pot with a questioning look. He nodded. She poured 2 cups and sat back down across from him and waited while he spread the copied land office page on the table beside Joseph's letters. He showed her the withdrawal notation. She read it twice, her finger tracing the handwriting, and when she looked up, her eyes had a particular quality, not surprise, but the specific expression of a person having the worst thing they suspected confirmed. "That's not Joseph's writing," she said, "and it isn't even close. The dating is wrong too. The ink hasn't aged the way the surrounding entries have. Someone added this notation well after the fact." He paused. "Your husband's application was never officially withdrawn. Briggs or someone working for him falsified a withdrawal to clear the record. Which means the original application may still be legally active. Which means before Briggs can establish any claim to this property or the water rights attached to it, he has a very inconvenient piece of incomplete paperwork standing in his way." Samuel picked up his coffee. "He knows that. It's why he moved quickly after he saw me today. He knows what I found." Eleanor was quiet, working through it. Outside, the night insects had started up the dry clicking sound of a Kansas summer evening, relentless and indifferent. "What do we do?" she said. "Tonight, nothing. Tomorrow morning, I need to get to Topeka." He watched her face. "The original application needs to be located and properly completed. There's a land commissioner there I know, Henry Marsh, an honest man, one of the few who wouldn't take Briggs's money if it was handed to him wrapped in gold cloth." He paused. "But I can't leave you here alone until tonight is settled." "What happens tonight?" "There's a man named Denny Marsh who drinks at the saloon on Thursday evenings." He watched her face carefully. "He works Briggs's south pasture. He said something after your husband died that he probably regrets. May Colton told me." Eleanor's hands went still around her coffee cup. "May Colton talked to you?" She did. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Something that looked like 12 months of isolation suddenly developing a small crack. "May hasn't spoken more than weather to me since Joseph died. I thought she was afraid." "She is," Samuel said. "She came and found me anyway." He looked at her steadily. "She's not the only one in this town who knows what Briggs is. She's just the first one willing to say it out loud." Eleanor looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "I want to come with you tonight, to the saloon." "I know. I mean it, Mr. Holt. That man knows something about what happened to my husband, and I have been sitting in this house for 14 months. I know." Samuel kept his voice level. "And you're going to stay here with your son because if Denny Marsh sees you walk in, he shuts down entirely. He's been carrying guilt about your family specifically. Guilt makes men silent when the person they've wronged is watching, but guilt also makes men talk to strangers." He held her eyes. "Let me do this part. I'll bring you everything he says." She didn't like it. She didn't pretend to like it. But she nodded once sharply because she was a practical woman, and she recognized the logic even when the logic required her to wait. Be careful, she said. I generally am. You rode into a yard with 3 armed men this morning over a child's note, she said. That is not the behavior of a generally careful person. Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then unexpectedly something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. Fair enough, he said. He was at the door when she spoke again, her voice quieter. Mr. Holt, what you told me earlier, about the man who was hanged. She waited until he turned. You said you had doubts and swallowed them. The fact that it still sits on you the way it does, that's not the character of a man who should have quit. Samuel was still for a moment. Good night, Mrs. Voss, he said. He rode back to town under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost solid, the heat finally beginning to release its grip on the day, now that the sun was gone. The saloon was the only building in Harlan's Crossing with genuine noise coming out of it at this hour, and Samuel tied Ranger at the rail and went inside with the deliberately unhurried walk of a man who belongs anywhere he decides to stand. The saloon was about half full. Samuel ordered whiskey at the bar and turned slowly to read the room and found Denny Marsh without much difficulty, a stocky, sunburned man in his late 40s, sitting alone at a corner table with a bottle that was already considerably lighter than it had started the evening. He had the look of a man drinking with purpose rather than pleasure. Samuel picked up his glass and walked over. Mind if I sit? Marsh looked up. He had the cautious, slightly unfocused eyes of a man 2/3 of the way to wherever he was trying to get. Free country, he said. Samuel sat. He didn't say anything for a moment. He sipped his whiskey and let the silence establish itself as something comfortable and undemanding. You're the one who was out at the Voss place today, Marsh said finally. I was. Word travels. It does in a town this size. Marsh looked at his bottle. Cole was pretty stirred up when he came back. I imagine he was. Another silence. Marsh poured himself another measure and looked at it. That woman's going to get herself hurt, he said. Not with satisfaction. With something closer to exhaustion. Mrs. Voss. She won't quit. Briggs has been trying to move her along for nearly a year and she just won't quit. He shook his head slowly. Some people got no sense of when they're beat. Or they've got something worth not quitting for, Samuel said mildly. Marsh glanced at him. You got kids? No. That boy of hers. Marsh looked back at his glass. He used to follow his daddy around the feed store like a little shadow, talking the whole time that boy. Never shut up. He was quiet for a moment. Not a word since. Samuel waited. I didn't know what they were going to do, Marsh said. The words came out lower, slightly compressed, like something that had been under pressure for a long time and was finding a very small exit. Briggs said he just wanted to talk to Voss. Scare him off the water filing. That's all it was supposed to be. Samuel kept his breathing even and his face still and said nothing because this was the moment where anything could stop it. Briggs sent me and 2 of the other boys to bring Voss around for a conversation. That's the words he used. A conversation. Marsh turned his glass slowly on the table. We found him on the barn roof like we knew we would because Briggs had eyes on the property. Billy Crane went up after him. He stopped. And, Samuel said very quietly, and Billy Crane is 230 pounds, and Voss was a lean man, and that roof wasn't wide. Marsh's jaw worked. It wasn't supposed to happen. That's what I told myself. But a man goes up after another man on a narrow roof with his fists up. What did Briggs think was going to happen? His voice had gone rough at the edges. I've been asking myself that question for 14 months. Where's Billy Crane now? Gone. Briggs sent him to work a ranch in Colorado about 2 weeks after. Marsh looked up. Convenient timing. And the other man with you. Pete Dorsey. He still works the south pasture. He won't talk. He's got a wife and 3 children, and Briggs holds the note on his house. Marsh finally met Samuel's eyes directly. I don't got a wife or children, just a bottle and a bad conscience, and I'm real tired of both. A beat. That what you wanted to hear? It's what I needed to hear, Samuel said. The question is what you're willing to do with it. Marsh stared at him. There's a land commissioner in Topeka named Henry Marsh, Samuel said. No relation, I assume. He is incorruptible, which is a rare thing and worth traveling to find. I'm riding to Topeka tomorrow morning to file the remainder of Joseph Voss's water rights application and to report a falsified land record. If there's a signed affidavit from you in my pocket when I get there describing exactly what you told me just now, that changes the shape of this considerably. An affidavit. Marsh said the word slowly. You understand what Briggs does to people who move against him. I understand what he does to people who don't, Samuel said. Marsh looked at his bottle for a long time. The saloon noise moved around them indifferent, the piano clunking through something unrecognizable in the far corner. If I sign something, Marsh said finally, I want it on record that I didn't touch Joseph Voss. That's the truth. I stayed on the ground. I couldn't stop what happened, but I didn't touch him. I'll put that in the document myself, Samuel said. Marsh pushed the bottle aside. You got paper. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out the folded papers and found a blank page at the back of the land office copy and turned it over. He set it on the table with a pencil. Marsh looked at the blank page for a moment, like a man standing at the edge of something with no way to judge the depth. Then he picked up the pencil and started writing slow and deliberate, the way a man writes when he knows the words are going to outlast the moment he's sitting in. Samuel sat and watched him write, and did not rush him. It took about 20 minutes. Marsh wrote everything. The order from Briggs, the names, the date, the barn roof. Billy Crane's name, the subsequent disappearance, the falsified withdrawal notation that Samuel described to him. He wrote it all in plain, unadorned language, and when he was done, he signed his name at the bottom with a steadiness that suggested he'd made a decision somewhere in the middle of writing, and the decision had settled him. He pushed the paper across the table. Samuel read through it carefully, folded it, and put it in his coat. You should not be alone tonight, Samuel said. I'll be fine. Denny. Samuel looked at him directly. Briggs will know you talked to me before morning. This saloon has eyes that belong to him, and you've been sitting with me for half an hour. Marsh was quiet. Is there somewhere you can go that isn't on Briggs's property? May Colton's got a storeroom she's offered me before. Her and her husband were friendly with mine before he passed. He paused. I always said no. Say yes tonight. Marsh looked at him. Then he pushed back his chair and stood up steadier than Samuel expected. You know this ain't going to be clean, he said. Briggs is not going to sit still for this. No, Samuel agreed. He isn't. He's going to come at her harder the minute he hears you've gone to Topeka. He'll use the time. I know. Samuel stood as well. Which is why I'm not going alone. He left Marsh heading for May Colton's store and rode back to the homestead faster than he'd left it, and when he came through the door, Eleanor was still at the table. She hadn't slept. She looked up at his face and read it immediately. He talked, she said. He talked. Samuel sat down and spread the affidavit on the table and watched her face as she read it. He watched the expression move through her, the confirmation, the grief, the fury, and something else underneath all of it, something fragile and terrible, the particular anguish of having suspected the worst thing and having it be true. She reached the end. She set the paper down flat with both hands. She didn't make a sound. Eleanor, Samuel said quietly. She looked up. Her eyes were full, but nothing had fallen yet. She was holding it with everything she had, the same way she'd been holding everything since the moment Joseph Voss went off that barn roof. He didn't fall, she said. No. She nodded once very slowly. Then she folded her hands on top of the affidavit and breathed, and Samuel sat across from her and didn't look away and didn't offer her anything useless, and the lamp burned low between them. After a long moment she said, What do we do now? I leave for Topeka at first light, he said. I need someone here I trust while I'm gone. He looked at her steadily. May Colton. She came to you, Eleanor said slowly. She's been waiting for a reason. I think she's ready. He paused. But I need to know you'll let her in, that you won't try to handle whatever Briggs sends on your own. Eleanor looked at him with something that was almost sharp. I have been handling things on my own for over a year. I know. And you've been extraordinary at it. He leaned forward slightly. But you have a son who already lost his father, and you are the only thing standing between him and... He stopped. I need you to still be here when I get back. She held his gaze for a long moment. Tommy shifted on his cot, murmuring in his sleep, and they both glanced at him involuntarily with the simultaneous instinct of two people who had both been listening to that child's breathing all evening. When she looked back at Samuel, something had shifted in her expression. Not surrender, something more deliberate than that. Come back quickly, she said. I intend to. He was at the door again when she said, Mr. Holt. He stopped. My husband would have liked you, she said. He respected men who did things because they were right, rather than because they were easy. A beat. I wanted you to know that. Samuel stood in the doorway with the warm Kansas night behind him, and the lamp glow in front of him, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing that wouldn't diminish it. He nodded once and stepped outside. He had just reached Ranger and was checking the saddle when he heard it not from the direction of the road, but from the far side of the barn. The deliberate, unhurried sound of a single horse moving through dry grass coming in from the dark land to the north, from the direction that a man would come if he didn't want to be seen from the main road. Samuel's hand dropped to his revolver. The horse stopped. A voice came from the darkness. Mr. Holt? The voice was smooth and unhurried. The voice of a man accustomed to being the most comfortable person in any room. My name is Harlan Briggs. I'd appreciate a word before you make any decisions you can't take back. Samuel stood very still in the dark yard, his hand on his gun, and waited. Harlan Briggs rode forward slowly into the edge of the lamplight, coming through the cabin window, and Samuel got his first clear look at the man. He was older than Samuel expected. Somewhere past 60, heavy-set but not soft, with a broad, pale face and white hair cut close under a good hat. He was dressed well for a man who had ridden out to a homestead in the dark pressed shirt, clean vest. The kind of careful presentation that said he had changed before coming, which meant he had thought about this meeting before arriving, which meant this was not a spontaneous visit. He was alone. That was the first thing Samuel had checked, scanning the darkness in both directions before allowing himself to look at the man directly. Keep your hands where I can see them, Samuel said. Briggs raised both hands slightly from his saddle, easy and unhurried like a man humoring a minor formality. I'm not here for trouble, Mr. Holt. Men who aren't here for trouble generally arrive in daylight by the front road. Briggs smiled faintly. He had the kind of smile that had been useful to him for decades, warm on the surface and entirely empty underneath. I thought a quieter approach might be better received, given the circumstances. Dismount, Samuel said, slowly. Briggs swung down from his horse with the careful movements of a heavy man getting older and stood in the yard with his hands still visible and looked at Samuel with the patient, assessing expression of a man who had spent a long career calculating other people. I heard you spent time at the land office today, Briggs said. Public records, Samuel said. Open to anyone. Indeed they are. Briggs looked toward the cabin. The lamp in the window made a yellow rectangle of light across the dark yard. I also heard you had a conversation at the saloon this evening. Also public, Samuel said. A man drinking at a table. Briggs nodded slowly as if this were all very reasonable. Mr. Holt, I have been in this county for 22 years. I came here with nothing. I built something. I employed men. I loaned money at fair rates to families who needed it. I invested in this town when no one else would. He paused. I am not a villain in a story. Joseph Voss fell off a barn roof, Samuel said. His 8-year-old son hasn't spoken since. The words landed. Briggs's expression changed very slightly, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, a brief contraction around the eyes that he controlled quickly. That was an accident, Briggs said. That's what you told yourself. It was not my intention. You sent men to a working man's property to physically intimidate him into abandoning illegal filing, Samuel said. Whatever your intention was, you made a choice that left a child without a father and a woman alone with a forged debt around her neck. The intention doesn't undo the outcome." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ground. When he looked back up, he had shifted approaches. "What would it take," he said, "to resolve this quietly?" "There is no quiet resolution." "There's always a quiet resolution, Mr. Holt. You know that as well as I do. You worked federal cases for 6 years. How many of them ended in a courtroom? How many were settled before they got that far?" "I'm listening," Samuel said. "Not because I'm interested, but because I want to hear what you think this is worth." Briggs reached into his coat slowly, watching Samuel's hand near the revolver, and produced a folded paper. He held it out. "The loan document. Consider it void. Mrs. Voss has no debt." "Keep going." Briggs's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll withdraw any claim on this property and file a formal notice of release with the land office. She can complete whatever water rights filing she wants." "The falsified withdrawal notation," Samuel said. "The record needs to be corrected." "It can be corrected." "Publicly, with a formal acknowledgement that the original entry was erroneous." Briggs studied him. "That's a more complicated ask." "It's the only ask that matters," Samuel said. "Because without it, the next man who looks at those records thinks Eleanor Voss voluntarily abandoned a water rights claim. And the one after that thinks the same, and 20 years from now, some lawyer is standing in a courtroom arguing that there's precedent for her family's claim being invalid." He looked at Briggs steadily. "You know exactly what you were doing when you had that notation added. I want it undone the same way it was done officially on the record in writing." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "And Denny Marsh?" "What about him?" "Whatever he told you tonight." Briggs's voice went careful and very level. "That stays between the parties involved." Samuel said nothing. "I am not an unreasonable man," Briggs said, and the patience in his voice had gone thinner now, something harder showing through underneath. "But I need to know that what Marsh said does not find its way to Topeka. You need to know," Samuel said, "that a man with a signed affidavit detailing what happened on this property the day Joseph Voss died is not going to sit quietly in exchange for a voided loan document." The yard went completely still. Briggs' expression changed for the first time in a way that was real, rather than managed. Something moved through it, not fear exactly, but a cold reappraisal, the calculation of a man who has just understood that the conversation he came here to have is not the conversation he is having. "Mr. Holt," Briggs said very quietly, "you are about to make a permanent enemy." "I had one of those when I rode into town this morning," Samuel said. "I noticed you didn't mention Billy Crane." Briggs went completely still. "Colorado's not that far," Samuel said. "A man can be found." For a moment, the only sound was the dry Kansas night, the insects, the soft movement of horses. Then behind Samuel, the cabin door opened. He heard it, and did not turn around, keeping his eyes on Briggs. "Mr. Holt." Eleanor's voice was quiet and entirely composed. "Go back inside, Mrs. Voss." "No." Her footsteps crossed the porch boards. She stopped beside him. He could see her in his peripheral vision, her arms at her sides looking at the man in her yard. Briggs looked at her. Something moved across his face at the sight of her, the particular discomfort of a man confronted with the full human weight of a consequence he had kept abstract. "Mrs. Voss," Briggs said. "Mr. Briggs." Her voice was even. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly because I think somewhere in you there is still a person capable of it." She paused. "Did you know what would happen when you sent those men to my barn?" Briggs was silent. "Not the accident," she said. "Not the specifics. But did you know there was a real possibility that my husband would be hurt?" The silence went on long enough to be its own answer. "My son was 9 years old," Eleanor said. "He found his father in the dirt. He has not said one word in 14 months. Not one word, Mr. Briggs. Not to me, not to anyone." Her voice stayed level, but something underneath it was terrible and quiet the way deep water is quiet. "I need you to understand what that means," I need you to carry that." Briggs looked at her, and for the first time all evening, the smooth, managed surface of the man cracked just enough to show something genuine beneath it, and what was beneath it was not comfortable to look at. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 22 years building something, and in the process of building it, he had made choices he had learned to step over, and now he was standing in a dark yard, with those choices looking at him from a woman's face, and they were bigger than he had allowed himself to know. "I am sorry," Briggs said. The words came out roughly without the polished delivery of everything else he'd said. They sounded real. They sounded like something it cost him. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Sorry is a beginning, not an end." Briggs looked at Samuel. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to come to the land office tomorrow morning," Samuel said. "Not Cole, you, in person. I want you to direct the correction of that withdrawal notation in front of the clerk and 2 witnesses. I want the forged loan document signed over as void in the same meeting. And I want a written statement acknowledging that this property and its water rights belong solely and completely to Eleanor Voss and her heirs." "And Marcia's affidavit?" Briggs's voice was quiet. "Goes to Topeka regardless," Samuel said. "I won't lie to you about that. What happens with it from that point is a decision for the land commissioner and the federal marshal's office. Not for me. But what I can tell you is this. A man who comes forward voluntarily, who corrects the record publicly, who makes restitution before he's compelled to, is looked upon differently than one who has to be dragged." He paused. "You've been a justice of the peace for 12 years. You know that's true." Briggs stood in the yard for a long moment. He looked at the cabin at Eleanor, at the dark land around him that he had spent 2 decades acquiring piece by piece, and Samuel watched him do a kind of calculation that had nothing to do with money or property. The kind of calculation a man does when he is old enough to start thinking about what he leaves behind him. 7 o'clock, Briggs said at last. 7 o'clock, Samuel confirmed. Briggs mounted his horse. He looked at Eleanor one more time. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Voss, your husband was a good man." "I know," she said. "That's why you were afraid of him." Briggs turned his horse and rode back the way he came, disappearing into the dark land, the sound of hoofbeats fading until the insects swallowed it completely. Eleanor stood beside Samuel, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "I believe he's afraid," Samuel said. "That's enough to work with. And if he doesn't come tomorrow, then I ride to Topeka with the affidavit and the copied land record, and it takes longer and gets louder and costs him considerably more." Samuel looked at her. "He knows that. It's why he came tonight instead of sending Cole." Eleanor exhaled slowly. It was the first fully released breath he had heard from her in 2 days. "I almost didn't come outside. You should have stayed inside. I know." She looked at the dark road where Briggs had gone. "But I needed him to see me, not a document, not a dispute, me." She paused. "I needed him to have to look at me and say that he was sorry." Did it help? She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a year." They stood in the yard a little longer, and then Eleanor said she was going to check on Tommy, and Samuel said he would stay out a while, and she went inside. He heard the door, the soft movement of her checking the boy, the small sounds of a house settling toward sleep. He sat on the porch step and looked at the stars and thought about what was still not settled. Briggs coming to the land office tomorrow morning was one thing, but the man hadn't ridden out here alone at night just to capitulate. He had come to assess the situation, to see how much Samuel had to determine whether the problem could be bought or managed before it became irreversible. If he had decided it couldn't, then the 7 o'clock meeting was a stall, and what came before dawn was something else entirely. Samuel stayed on the porch until after midnight watching the road. A little before 1 in the morning, May Colton arrived in a buckboard with Denny Marsh beside her on the seat, which was not what Samuel had expected, but which made complete sense when he thought about it. May had decided something the same way she always decided things completely without requiring anyone's permission. She climbed down from the buckboard with a basket over her arm and looked at Samuel on the porch step with the brisk practicality of a woman who had been awake since before dawn and had no intention of pretending otherwise. "Heard Briggs rode out here," she said. "Word travels fast even at midnight." "Briggs's stableman is my cousin's boy," she said. "He noticed Briggs taking his horse out the back way and thought I ought to know." She looked at him squarely. "What happened?" Samuel told her. She listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who had learned that interrupting wasted time. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "You think he'll come tomorrow?" she said. "I think there's a reasonable chance." "And if he doesn't, then I need someone here with Eleanor while I'm on the road to Topeka." He looked at her. "I was going to ask you in the morning." "I'm here now," May said simply. She looked at Marsh, who had climbed down and was standing with the look of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see what it costs him. "Denny's going to stay too. He can sleep in the barn." Marsh looked at Samuel. "She didn't ask me," he said. "She told me." "That sounds right," Samuel said. May went inside to check on Eleanor and Samuel, and Marsh stood in the yard in the way of men who don't have much to say to each other, but share enough common ground to stand in the same silence without it being uncomfortable. "You think he'll send someone tonight?" Marsh asked. "I think if he was going to, it would have been before he came himself," Samuel said. "He came to see if there was a deal to be made. That means he hadn't decided on the other option yet." He paused. "The visit bought us the night. What he decides before morning is a different question." Marsh nodded. He looked at the cabin at the light still on in the window. "She's something, that woman," he said quietly. "Standing her ground all this time with nothing but her own spine to lean on." "She had her son," Samuel said. "Her son's 8 years old and can't speak. He found me on the road and put a note in my hand," Samuel said. "I'd call that more than nothing." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon so." The rest of the night passed without incident. Samuel dozed on the porch in the chair May had brought out from inside, waking every hour or so to check the road, finding nothing each time but the dark land and the stars and the dry clicking of the summer insects. Dawn came in gray and then gold, and the heat began building almost immediately, the way it did in Kansas in July, no slow warming, just the sun arriving and meaning it. At 6:30, Samuel washed at the pump and came inside to find the kitchen table set and Eleanor making breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Tommy was awake, sitting at the table, watching Samuel with the careful eyes that were his particular language. Samuel sat down across from him. Tommy looked at him for a moment, then reached into his shirt pocket and produced a new piece of paper, smaller than the first, folded once. He pushed it across the table. Samuel unfolded it. "Is it over?" Samuel looked at the boy. At the careful handwriting. The 2 words, the question that contained everything. His father. His silence. His mother. Standing at windows. The long, frightened months of a child who had stopped speaking because the world had stopped making sense. Samuel picked up the pencil Tommy had left on the table. He wrote beneath the question, "Not yet, but close. Stay close to your mother today." He folded the paper back and pushed it across. Tommy read it. He looked up at Samuel, and something in his face was very serious. The seriousness of a child who has decided to trust someone fully, and is now holding that decision. He put the paper in his pocket. "Eat something," Eleanor said behind Samuel. She set a plate down in front of him, and when her hand moved away, it brushed his shoulder lightly briefly, the way a person touches something to confirm it is real and solid and there. He ate. She sat across from him. Tommy ate steadily between them, with his eyes moving from one adult face to the other, reading the room the way he always did, and what he seemed to read appeared to settle him. At 5 minutes to 7, Samuel stood and put on his coat and checked his revolver. Eleanor looked at him. "If he doesn't come..." "He'll come," Samuel said. "How do you know?" Samuel thought about it. About Briggs standing in the yard in the dark, saying "I'm sorry" in that rough, unmanaged voice. about the way the man had looked at Eleanor at the weight of what he'd been carrying and having it named. "Because he's been stepping over this for 14 months, Samuel said. "And last night, he couldn't step over it anymore. He looked at you and he saw what it cost." He picked up his hat. "Some men get to a point where they're tired of who they've been. It doesn't make them good, but it makes them willing." He was almost to the door when Tommy appeared in front of him again, blocking the way with the gentle, determined authority of a child who has decided something. He held up his hand. Samuel stopped. Tommy looked at him with absolute directness for a moment. Then he put his hand on Samuel's arm, the way he had put his hand on the stirrup the first morning, and held on, and looked at him, and the look said everything the boy did not have words for. Samuel put his hand briefly over the boy's. "I'll be back," he said. Tommy let go. Samuel walked out into the blazing Kansas morning and pointed himself toward town, and behind him the cabin door stayed open, and Eleanor stood in it, and he did not look back, but he felt it the way a man feels when something worth returning to is watching him go. Harlan Briggs was already at the land office when Samuel arrived. That was the first surprise. Samuel had expected to find the building dark, or Cole standing at the door with legal papers, and a sheriff's deputy, or any number of arrangements that would signal the night's apparent capitulation, had been replaced by something harder in the daylight. Instead, Briggs was there standing inside the small office, in the same careful clothes he'd worn the night before, his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had not slept. The young clerk was there too, standing behind the counter with the expression of someone watching something unprecedented and not entirely sure it was safe to breathe. Samuel came through the door, and Briggs turned. "Mr. Holt," Briggs said. "Mr. Briggs." Samuel looked at him carefully. The smoothness of the previous night was gone. What was left was older and more tired and more honest. "You came alone. I told Cole to stay home." Briggs set his hat on the counter. "What I have to do today isn't something I need a witness to perform for." Samuel looked at the clerk. "You'll need 2 witnesses. Can you send for someone?" "I already did," the clerk said quietly. He had the look of a person who had made his own decision somewhere between midnight and dawn and arrived early to act on it. "May Colton said she'd come, and Reverend Aldous from the church on the South Road said he'd be here at 7. Samuel looked at Briggs. Briggs said nothing, just nodded once. May arrived at 3 minutes past 7, with Reverend Aldous behind her, a thin, elderly man with the kind of steady eyes that came from decades of watching people in their worst moments and choosing not to flinch. He shook Briggs's hand without warmth or coldness, just acknowledgement, and stood beside the counter. What followed took less time than Samuel expected, and more out of Briggs than Samuel anticipated. The clerk laid out the ledger and opened it to the falsified entry. Briggs looked at it for a moment, really looked at it with the expression of a man confronting a physical object that represents the worst version of himself. And then he picked up the pen and wrote the correction in his own hand, clear and unambiguous, and dated it and signed it. He stated aloud for both witnesses that the original withdrawal notation had been entered in error and did not reflect any action taken by the property holder. The clerk noted the correction in the margin, and both witnesses signed below it. Then came the loan document. Briggs produced it from his coat, the original with the forged signature, and held it on the counter for a moment. His hand was on it. Samuel watched his face through that moment, the weight of it, the specific heaviness of holding something that represented a deliberate wrong. And then Briggs picked up the pen and wrote "Void" across the face of it in large, clear letters, and signed beneath, and dated it, and pushed it across the counter. "She gets the original," Briggs said to the clerk. "Delivered to the property today. Not sent through Cole. You take it yourself." The clerk nodded. "Yes, sir." The written statement acknowledging full title and water rights to Eleanor Voss and her heirs was the last document. It was the most formal and the most final. And when Briggs signed it, Samuel watched the man's hand on the pen and thought about what it cost to write your name beneath something that permanently closed a door you had spent years trying to force open. When it was done, Briggs straightened. He looked at Samuel. "The affidavit," he said. "Goes to Topeka," Samuel said. "As I told you, I won't change that." Briggs absorbed it. He had known it. He had come anyway. What happens from there is out of my hands. And mine, Samuel said. The federal marshal's office will make their own determination. What you did today will be part of the record they consider. Briggs picked up his hat from the counter. He looked at May Colton, who was watching him with the particular expression of a woman who had known him for 12 years and was revising every year of that acquaintance in real time. May, he said. Harlan, she said. He nodded at the Reverend, who nodded back with the same measured neutrality. Then Briggs walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame, not looking back. The water was the wrong reason, he said to no one in particular, or to the room, or perhaps to himself. I've had enough water for 20 years. I don't know what I thought a little more would change. He went out. The room was quiet for a moment. Then May let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Reverend Aldous folded his hands and looked at the ceiling briefly, with the expression of a man offering a private wordless comment upward. The clerk looked at the corrected ledger with the expression of a person who has watched something historic and is still processing whether it was real. Samuel picked up the voided loan document and the title statement. He shook the clerk's hand. He nodded at the Reverend. He turned to May. "Tell her I'm on the road to Topeka," he said. "Tell her to keep the door latched until the clerk comes with the documents, and tell her—" He stopped for a moment. "Tell her it held." May looked at him with sharp, warm eyes. "I will," she said. "How long to Topeka and back?" 3 days if the roads are clear." "I'll stay at the homestead," she said, as if this had never been a question. He rode hard the first day, making 30 miles through the brutal July heat, stopping only to water Ranger and rest him briefly at midday. The land flattened and opened up as he moved northeast, vast and dry and indifferent. He thought about Eleanor at the window. He thought about Tommy's hand on his arm. He thought about the folded note in his breast pocket, and checked once with his hand that it was still there, which it was. Henry Marsh, Land Commissioner for the Northeastern District of Kansas Territory, was a compact man of 55 with a gray beard and the methodical precision of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that the paperwork of people's lives was handled correctly. He received Samuel in his office on the second morning, and read through every document without speaking, which was the mark of a man who knew that speaking during reading was a waste of both activities. When he finished, he set everything on his desk and looked at Samuel. "The falsified withdrawal notation," he said. "Corrected as of yesterday morning," Samuel said. "I have a copy with both witnesses' signatures. The loan document. Voided by Briggs himself in front of witnesses. Original delivered to Mrs. Voss." Marsh looked at the affidavit. He read through it a second time. His expression when he looked back up was very controlled. "Denny Marsh. No relation." "No relation," Samuel confirmed. "He understands what this means for him legally." "He does. He states clearly that he did not physically contact Joseph Voss. He acknowledges his presence and his failure to intervene. He names Billy Crane as the direct actor, and Harlan Briggs as the originating party." Samuel looked at him steadily. "He came forward without compulsion. That matters." Marsh set the affidavit down. He picked up the incomplete water rights application, the one with Joseph Voss's name on it, the one that had been waiting in the files for 14 months with a false withdrawal attached to it. He looked at it for a long moment. "Joseph Voss began this filing properly," Marsh said quietly. "The preliminary submission was complete and correctly executed. The withdrawal was fraudulent, which means the application has been in a legally active state this entire time." He reached for his pen. "I'm going to complete the processing myself and date the approval retroactively to the original submission date." Samuel was still for a moment. "That means the water rights have legally belonged to the Voss property for over a year, which means any action Briggs took in that period based on an assumption that the rights were uncontested was taken in error." Marsh's voice was perfectly level. "That has implications for the Callaway property acquisition. His entire eastern land strategy may need to be revisited." He began writing. "I'll be notifying the federal marshal's office in Topeka today regarding the affidavit. They'll determine their own course from there." He looked up briefly. You did the right thing bringing this here in person, Holt. A letter gets filed. A man in the room gets action. Samuel rode back in 2.5 days, pushing harder than was entirely comfortable, and arrived at the homestead on a late afternoon when the heat was finally beginning to break towards something that might eventually become evening. He heard the sound before he was fully through the gate. Not a voice exactly, but something that stopped him. May was sitting on the porch steps. She looked up when he rode in, and her face told him everything, before she opened her mouth, and what it told him was something that cracked straight through the controlled professionalism he had been maintaining for 3 days, and reached the part of him he'd been keeping carefully sealed. He talked, May said. This morning. Samuel dismounted. Tommy. One word. She stood, and her voice was slightly unsteady, which was the most remarkable thing he had ever heard from May Colton. His mother was hanging the wash, and he came up behind her, and he said. She stopped for a moment and pressed her lips together. He said, Mama. The word sat in the hot Kansas air between them. Just the one word, Samuel asked. So far, May said. But the way he said it. She shook her head. The way he said it. Samuel stood for a moment with his hand on Ranger's flank, not moving. Something was moving through him that he had been not feeling for 1.5 years, and it was moving through him now, whether he chose to allow it or not. The cabin door opened and Eleanor stepped out. She saw him and stopped on the porch. She was wearing the same gray dress sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hair was coming loose the same way it always seemed to be, and she looked at him across the yard with an expression he didn't immediately have a name for relief and recognition, and something forward-facing that was neither of those things. You're back, she said. Told you I would be. She came down the porch steps. How did it go? The water rights are approved, retroactively from the original filing date. The corrections are on record. He reached into his coat and produced the documentation from Marsh's office and held it out. She took it and read the first page, and her hand tightened on the paper. Briggs's Eastern land claims are being reviewed. The marshal's office has the affidavit. He paused. It isn't finished. There'll be legal proceedings. It could take months. But the foundation's solid, and it's in the right hands now. Eleanor read. She read every word with the focused intensity of a woman who had learned not to trust anything that wasn't written down, and signed and witnessed, and Samuel stood in the yard and let her read. When she finished, she held the papers against her chest for a moment, with her eyes closed. Joseph filed that application, she said quietly. He rode to Topeka in 4 days for the preliminary submission. He was so sure it would protect us. It did, Samuel said. Just took a little longer than he planned. She opened her eyes. They were full, and she didn't try to manage it this time. May told me about Tommy, Samuel said. Eleanor nodded. She pressed one hand briefly to her mouth. One word. Just the one, and then he went quiet again. But the way he... Her voice broke slightly, and she gathered it back. It was his real voice. His actual voice. I hadn't heard it in 14 months, and I had started to wonder if I'd ever... She stopped. I know what it means. It means something shifted. It means he's coming back. He will, Samuel said. He's been in there the whole time. He just needed the world to make sense again. From inside the cabin came a sound, the screen door, small bare feet on the porch boards, and Tommy appeared at the top of the steps. He looked at Samuel across the yard, and his face did the thing it had been doing since that first morning on the road, that precise and total reading. And then he did something he hadn't done before. He smiled, not a small, cautious, evaluating expression. A real smile, sudden and wide and completely unguarded, the smile of a child who had been carrying a weight far too large for his age, and felt it lift. Samuel walked to the porch steps. He crouched down to the boy's level the way he had in the beginning on the road, taking the crumpled note. Tommy reached into his shirt pocket and produced a new piece of paper folded once. He held it out. Samuel took it and opened it. You came back. Samuel looked at the boy for a moment. At the brown eyes serious and warm, watching him with that complete, unguarded trust that children offer when they have decided it's finally safe, and which is the most significant thing a human being can offer another. He picked up the pencil stub Tommy was holding out. He wrote, "I said I would." He folded it back, and Tommy put it in his pocket, patting it flat the way he patted all his notes. And then he reached out and took Samuel's hand, just held it, and stood there on the porch steps, with the absolute simplicity of a child who has decided something permanent. May Colton came around from the side of the house where she had been giving them privacy, and she looked at the three of them on the porch and looked at the sky and said, "I believe there might be a cloud forming to the west. First one in 6 weeks." Eleanor looked up. "May Colton, you're the only woman in Kansas who can make rainfall sound like something she personally arranged." "I know the right people," May said. Samuel laughed. It was a quiet, genuine sound, the kind that comes without preparation, and it surprised him more than anyone. Eleanor looked at him when he laughed, and something opened up fully in her face for the first time. Not the careful, guarded warmth of the past 3 days, but something direct and unprotected, and she let him see it, which was its own kind of statement. The weeks that followed built themselves carefully and without hurry. The federal marshal's office made 2 visits to Harlan's Crossing. Denny Marsh gave his testimony formally and went through it with the steady determination of a man who had decided that living honestly with consequences was preferable to living comfortably with guilt. Pete Dorsey, after a conversation with Samuel that lasted 2 hours and covered the full extent of what was already documented, added his own statement. Billy Crane was located in Colorado and extradited before the end of summer. Harlan Briggs faced a federal inquiry that lasted into the following year. He did not go to prison. The legal machinery of the territory moved slowly, and his lawyers moved quickly. But he was removed as justice of the peace. The Callaway property acquisition was overturned, and what remained of his land holdings after the legal proceedings were the honest holdings of a man whose reach had been permanently reduced to what he'd legitimately earned. He lived quietly after that. The deputy with the small eyes found different work in a different county before winter. The water rights document, approved and retroactively dated, went into Eleanor's Bible, between the pages, where Joseph had kept the original land grant for 2 years before she made him move it somewhere safer. She put it there herself, deliberate and specific, and she did not move it. Samuel stayed, not temporarily, not as a passing arrangement, but in the way a man stays when he has finally understood that the reason he stopped moving is the same reason he should have stopped years earlier. He built a second room onto the cabin in September, working with the methodical patience of a man who understands that what he is building matters more than how quickly it gets built. May Colton supplied the lumber and refused to be thanked for it. Reverend Aldous came out and inspected the work and nodded approvingly, and said nothing that could be quoted. Tommy said his second word 6 weeks after his first. The second word was Samuel's name said clearly once on a morning when Samuel was at the kitchen table, reviewing the water rights documentation for a neighboring homesteader who had heard about the Voss case and come for advice. Samuel had looked up from the papers and found the boy standing in the doorway watching him. And the boy had said it with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything. Just the name, just the fact of it, placing Samuel in the category of people who were permanent. "Good morning, Tommy," Samuel said. Tommy came in and sat across from him and reached for the pencil, and he wrote something on the corner of the homesteader's paper, and then he turned it so Samuel could read it. "Will you stay?" Samuel set down the document. He looked at the boy across the table, at the face that had read him from the first moment on the road and had been reading him clearly ever since, and he thought about what it meant that this child who had been robbed of language by the worst day of his life had used 2 of his returning words on Samuel's name and this question. He picked up the pencil. He wrote yes. Tommy read it. He sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with things that mattered. Then he reached into his pocket and produced the very first note. The original crumpled sweat-damp note, the one Samuel had tucked into his breast pocket on the road, and he laid it on the table between them and smoothed it carefully flat with both hands. "Please, sir. My mama needs help. They come tonight. Nobody in town will help us. Please, Tommy." and below it in handwriting that Tommy had added recently, in letters more practiced and confident than the original, one more line. He came. Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind her son, coffee in both hands, and she looked at the table, and at what was written there, and at Samuel's face. And what she saw in his face made her own face do something quiet and absolute, and finished like a question that had been waiting a long time, receiving finally its right answer. She set one coffee down in front of him. Her hand rested on his shoulder, warm and certain, and without any hesitation at all. Outside, the first real clouds of the breaking summer moved across the Kansas sky, and on the land that had always belonged to the Voss family, the dry grass began at last to bend toward rain. Tommy Voss got his voice back that autumn, word by word, day by day, until the cabin was loud with it, the way Eleanor had not let herself remember it could be. And the boy who had once gone silent because the world stopped making sense grew up on land his father had fought for, and his mother had refused to surrender, with a man at the table who had answered a note from a child and meant every word he wrote. Some things once kept are kept forever.